So good evening. My name is Sister Kathleen Duffy, and as president of the American Teilhard Association, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's program. Can you hear me? Sure. Oh, this way. A nice cream cone, I always say. So I'm pleased to welcome you. A particularly warm welcome to many of you who have probably not been at any of our programs before, but certainly for those who have, we're so glad to see you once again. Okay. The American Teilhard Association was established in 1967 to extend knowledge of the cosmic vision of Teilhard de Chardin, to encourage its critical study, and to apply his thought as we examine humanity's place in the cosmos, as well as our responsibility for directing the development of an evolving world. I encourage you to become a member. You can find information on our website. Before we begin, let you know, those of you who are here in person, we have some books in the back. And Amy, who's sitting up here, will be glad to help you to purchase anything. Actually, one of those books is by Amy, and I would ask even those of you who are not here to think about purchasing it. It's a beautiful book, a beautiful meditation on some of Teilhard's work. And so, just so I don't forget that. So I want to tell you how we're going to proceed tonight. So after I introduce our speaker, and after we listen to his lecture, we will open the floor to questions and comments. For those on Zoom, we suggest that during the lecture, or whenever you have a question, you think of a question or a comment, to type it in the chat. Here, you can just remember your question, and we will, use the actual raise the hand. You can raise your hand, and we'll be taking questions afterwards. So just so you know, there will be time for comments and questions at the end. So this evening, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. John Haught, Distinguished Research Professor and Emeritus in the Department of Theology at Georgetown University. A systematic theologian with particular interest in the nexus of science, cosmology, evolution, and ecology, Haught is among the most creative and constructive theologians in the field of science and religion, providing a brilliant and exhilarating analysis of what faith might mean in an age of science. He takes a deep and serious look at the science of our time and articulates an evolution-friendly theology, one that reveals a universe full of potential and promise. His deep concern for ecology, transhumanism, the value of human life, and the meaning of suffering and death, issues for our time, gives further depth and relevance to his analysis, offers a way for believers to think about how religion relates to discoveries in modern science, and as a consequence suggests the possibility of a robust and credible faith. The author of 25 books, more or less, I hope I got that number right, more than 100 book chapters and articles, as well as hundreds of invited lectures and academic presentations, Haught plumbs the profound depths of the universe and offers fresh insight into the biblical nature of hope. In order to clarify his position with those who differ with him, he has engaged countless stirring debates with both the new atheists and the creationists. And in 2005, he testified as an expert witness on behalf of the plaintiffs at the Intelligent Design trial in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Despite his brilliance, John Haught is a humble man who has dedicated his life to an exceptionally clear articulation of a theology that not only satisfies the mind, but also touches the heart. Jack, we are so happy, wherever you are, that you are here with us this evening. And I'm sure that all of us here and those of us on Zoom are anxious to hear what you have to say and to share with us. And so we welcome you warmly to Daylesford Abbey and to the American Teilhard Association.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Kathy reminded me this evening that we first met in 1996, and we have been great friends ever since. She's been one of the bright lights in my life ever since. So thank you for that wonderful, generous introduction. I want to thank Andrew also for his hospitality and having me here. And I was happy to meet some other friends this evening at dinner. And I'm very grateful for all of you coming here tonight when you could be home watching the World Series. And so, or maybe I'll leave time for that later on. But I started teaching science and religion at Georgetown back in 1970. And ever since that time, I've been interested in two big questions. The first one is whether science as a way of knowing leaves any room for faith in the religious sense of the term, and also whether scientific discoveries such as evolution and Big Bang cosmology, genetics, and other sciences, whether they leave us room for hope. And in this process of answering or trying to find some answer to that question, I had to ask a question that would not have occurred to our ancestors in religion and religious faith. And that's the question, what's really going on in the universe? It so happened, and I'll talk about that this evening, that it was only in the 20th century that science discovered that the universe is something that's not just plopped there or that's eternally there, but it's a process of becoming. It's still coming into being. In other words, the cosmos is a story. And one of the first scientists to have emphasized this point was the Jesuit geologist and paleontologist, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And so in the last 20, 30, 40 years almost, I've been very interested in asking Teilhard again and again what he can contribute to answering these big questions. In case any of you are not familiar with Teilhard, whether here or in Zoom land, just a few words about who he was. I said he was a Jesuit priest, geologist, born in 1881 in France, died in New York in 1955. As a young man, after he had studied some geology, which is an evolutionary science, he started asking questions about how to integrate his faith with what he was learning in his studies of geology and later paleontology and biology. He started writing papers on these topics, and his religious superiors saw that they were being circulated among tender minds, and they thought it would be better for those tender minds if Teilhard would just disappear from the European theater and spend a quarter of a century or so in China, which is the wrong place to send people who like to dig up old bones and rocks. And so while he was there, he became one of the top 2 or 3 geologists of the Asian continent, widely and deeply, uncontroversially accepted and praised by his scientific colleagues. He eventually suffered another form of exile. He came to New York and worked at the American Museum of Natural History and died while he was still working there in 1955. He's buried up in Poughkeepsie, New York. While he was in China and elsewhere, he kept up writing religious essays and books, especially The Phenomenon of Man, now translated as The Human Phenomenon. And he was unable not allowed, not given permission by his order or the Vatican to publish his major work, The Phenomenon. And so he died and was relatively unknown, not scientifically, but religiously and theologically. And it was only after he died that his religious works or his religious commentaries on science were flooding the market of publishers. Harper and Row said that The Phenomenon of Man was the #1 religious bestseller in the 20th century for them, for Harper and Row. So in all these books, he's asking the question I've been asking all my life since starting to teach science and religion, whether we can find in the universe reasons for hope. And I've come to think of theology, at least as I understand theology, primarily as a quest, in line with 1 Peter's suggestion that we have to be prepared to give reasons for our faith. I've been looking into the universe of science to see if we can find there reasons for hope. And as we'll see tonight, most scientists, almost all of them, have doubted whether the universe provides reasons for hope. Teilhard was pretty much alone in telling us that if we look carefully, we will find reasons for hope, not just in religion, but in the universe itself. And that we can come up with a new meaning of Christ along the lines of St. Paul's and St. John's cosmic Christ. If we study the whole Christian religion, Christian faith and theology, against the backdrop of a universe that's still coming into being. He told everybody during his lifetime, you've got to get it into your mind, into your bones, into every fiber of your being, that we live in a universe that's still unfinished, still coming into being, and that will change everything. It will provide a whole new framework for faith and theology. So back to the first question, does science as a way of knowing leave any room for faith? One answer to that question is called scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is the only reliable guide to truth, and hence there is no future to faith. And the people recently most representative of scientism were the new atheists who flourished around the turn of the millennium. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens sold many, many books convincing people, or trying to convince people, that science leaves no room for faith. Their thinking was that science is opposed to faith. Science is based on evidence, they said. Of course, they meant scientific evidence, whereas faith is defined as belief without evidence. Science is said to be objective. It doesn't require the complicity of personal biases. It's purely objective. It's out there, whereas religion and faith are subjective. So they're opposed on that score as well. So consequently, science is rational and faith seems to be irrational to the new atheists. Sometimes people don't like to be called devotees of scientism, even though they are. But Richard Dawkins was not one of them. Dawkins says it may be that humanity will never reach complete understanding, but if we do, I venture the confident prediction that it will be science, not religion, that brings us there. And if that sounds like scientism, so much the better for scientism. In my classes and in my writings, the way in which I treated this phenomenon of scientism, since it is the main obstacle that the intellectual world has come up with to oppose the reality of faith and religion, is to ask whether scientism is itself reasonable. And it's not. It's logically self-refuting. Scientism says take nothing on faith, and yet if you examine it, it takes faith to embrace scientism. Faith, there's no scientific experiments that you can set up to prove that science is the only road to truth. You're making some assumptions, even in setting up such an experiment. After all, what is the evidence that science is the only road to truth. And in addition, aren't there other ways of knowing that are quite different from science, like interpersonal knowing? You can only get in touch with the reality of another person if you refrain from objectifying or treating that person as an object and learn to enter into and surrender to the aura of subjectivity that surrounds each person. Also, aesthetic knowing, getting in touch with the reality of beauty, requires something quite different from science. In fact, the more you analyze a painting, the more you lose touch with the overall aesthetic phenomenon. You have to allow yourself to be carried away by the aesthetic object in a way that's quite different from the way science works in objectifying things, at least. And so if there's such a thing as religious knowing, it would be comparable or analogous to interpersonal knowing, especially if you believe in a personal God. How can you abandon personal knowing in the relationship to a personal God? And scientists also need to trust. And one of the things that has fascinated me is how innocent most scientists are of the tacit faith commitments that they have to make in their work. A scientist, just to look at how science works, a scientist looks into a restricted range of empirically available data, whether in biology, chemistry, physics, cosmology, or whatever, and leaves everything else out so as to focus on this particular set of empirical data. And the scientist looks into this data in search of intelligibility. And the intelligibility is often expressed in mathematical terms or in terms of geometry, especially Einstein looked at the world geometrically. And since not every right idea is a true idea, since not every right hypothesis or right theory is necessarily true, the main work of science, after constructing hypotheses and theories, is to test them over and over again. And in order to be willing to test your hypothesis, you have to have a personal love of, commitment to truth, no matter how much that hurts. So this commitment to truth is not unlike the religious commitment to God, as even the medieval theologians pointed out. They'll get to that a little bit later on. So you have to subject your hypothesis to testing and even revision. And sometimes this is very, very painful. And sometimes people refuse to do that. They cheat. But the great scientists are almost always people who have suffered quite a bit in testing and revising their hypothesis. Good scientists tell you that it's a success for science when it realizes it has to revise its understanding. So there are 4 tacit faith assumptions that are required then to do objective science. You have to have faith that the universe is intelligible. I mean, if deep down in your heart you decided the universe is not intelligible, you couldn't even ask a question about it. So you have to have a trust. It's a beautiful thing, the way we trust in the intelligibility of the universe. Einstein said that's the most mysterious thing we can encounter. The fact that the universe is comprehensible at all is the most incomprehensible mystery of what we can imagine. And Einstein was willing to use the word faith to talk about this commitment to intelligibility. You have to have a belief, a personal belief, that truth is worth seeking. You will have had to undergo a transformation, a kind of moral transformation as a scientist to arrive at that point of really believing that truth, no matter how much it hurts, is worth seeking. Science can't get along, it can't progress without that faith commitment. You also, since science is a social enterprise, you have to have belief in the rightness of honesty in your experiments and make sure that you share lovingly your data with those who are not familiar with it. Good scientists are always willing to share. And that's a faith commitment, that sharing is good, that love is worthwhile. And then something we don't think about very often, in order to do science, we have to have trust that our minds are of sufficient stature and integrity to distinguish between bright ideas and true ideas. And that's something that takes a lot of discipline. It's almost like a conversion that you have to go through to put yourself in the right frame of mind here. So where then do we locate theology in relation to science as we understand it this way? Not here, not where we're spinning hypotheses and theories. And I mention that because almost all problems are pseudo-problems that arise in relating science to religion arise because either scientists or religious people are putting the idea of God and other religious claims in the same basket with theories of science and placing them, therefore, in an artificial competitive relationship with scientific ideas. This is especially the case with evolution. The creationists who believe that Genesis is the best science available place the idea of creation over against evolution and thus cannot reconcile them. So what we have to do in theology and science is find a way to locate theology so that it will never enter into a competitive relationship with science. And we're going to see a little bit later that someone who did this really well, with great nuance, was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So where do you place theology? Theology and religion cannot give us scientific information. In 1893, Pope Leo XIII, a rather conservative pope, issued an encyclical, Providentissimus Deus. It was not too long after Darwin had published his theories in 1859. And in this encyclical, this pope instructed Catholics never to look for scientific information in the scriptures. And the great biblical scholar Raymond Brown once wrote that this simple instruction saved or spared several generations of Catholics the anguish of trying to reconcile evolutionary ideas and other scientific ideas with what they were learning in their religious instructions or what they were celebrating in their liturgical rites. So, where do we locate theology? Theology's place, I believe, or have come to believe, is to respond not to scientific questions, but to more fundamental questions. Questions that arise once you realize the faith commitments that are necessary to do science. And one of those questions is, well, why is the universe intelligible at all? Not too many people ask that question, but sometimes if you're a scientist, you drive home and you're on your way home into the house and you say, why am I doing this? You know, what am I really trying to get at? You're on the edge of a religious question when you ask that. Or why is truth worth seeking? Why should I suffer so much for truth? And that's a place where theology can come in. Theology is not the only way of responding to those questions. Philosophers and others in common sense would give its own answers to those questions. But at least by relating theology primarily to these limit questions, these questions that arise at the limit of various disciplines, you're sparing the pseudo problem of trying to reconcile religious claims or scriptural passages with modern science. Why is honesty unconditionally right? And why should I trust my mind? If I get that far tonight, I want to see how Teilhard finesses those questions. We'll get a good idea of how he deals with science and cosmology and religion. So theology looks not to answer scientific questions, but looks for a generous worldview that can give a reasonable response to these four questions that arise at the limits of science.